I have been so excited to be able to spend this time with you all and share this time with Professor Zeira. I'm very honored. I just want to share with you guys that I've been working in the field of social work with child welfare for the last 20 years in different capacities, but I've known things of the history and the way that we do child welfare in the US, but preparing for today has actually been very enlightening to me, being able to do a little bit of additional research, dig in a little bit, think about why things have come to be the way they are today in the US. And so I'm very excited to hear your thoughts on some of the things that I share and the things that I've learned. And anyway, so without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started. So once again, I'm so grateful for this opportunity. I'm going to review some current data on children in foster care in the US, as well as a very brief history of how foster care came to be as it is today. I would like to recognize, first of all, that I'm really giving a very high bird's eye view, as each of the 50 different states in the US are responsible for their own implementation and management of their child welfare systems, which then means that every state does things a bit differently. So to start, this chart gives us a glance at the number of children in foster care across the country for 5 years, from 2016 to 2020. You'll notice that it groups the years into fiscal years. So what that means is October 1st through September 30th of each calendar year. You can see a decreasing trend of the total number of children served by the foster care system, with nearly 632,000 children served in 2020. A little over 407,000 children were in the custody of the state child welfare system on September 30th of 2020. This decrease in the numbers over these years could be an indication of many different things, including some focused efforts by advocates and professionals hoping to decrease the presence of child welfare in children and families' lives, but it also could be a reflection of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the awareness and the ability to intervene in instances of child abuse and neglect. So it'll be interesting when we are able to get the aggregate total numbers in the data for 2021 and then in 2022 to see as the impact of the pandemic continues to lessen and more children return to normal school attendance. So on the last day of the fiscal year in 2020, the average age of children still in custody was a little over 8 years old, with children remaining in foster care, let's put that up there, for an average of 21 months or almost 2 years. The median statistic here shows us that the majority of children, though, remain in foster care for just a bit over 1 year at about 15 months. It is really important in the US foster care data to take a moment to look at the racial and ethnic statistics. 43% of the children in care were Caucasian, with 23% African American and 22% of Hispanic ethnicity. These numbers are important to look at and contrast with the proportions of each of these groups in the overall US population. The most recent US Census gives us the data that right at 50% of the children in the US are Caucasian. So 43% being in foster care is just a bit lower than this overall proportion. But one of the most challenging statistics we have struggled with for many years in the US is the disproportionality of children of color in foster care, specifically our African American children. So the most recent census tells us that there's about 14% of the US population of children are African American, which is pretty significant difference from the 23% in state custody. Okay, and this next table shows us the case plan goal. So what is the goal for the children in care at the end of the 2020 fiscal year? Over half of the children in this group were still moving towards the goal of reunifying with parents, but over a quarter of these children were in a plan of adoption, with an additional 4% moving towards guardianship. This is a total of 126,723 children who will be exiting foster care to be adopted into a family other than their birth parents. A number of these adoptions are adoptions by kin or blood relatives, but a significant portion of them are being adopted by the foster family with whom they were living with while in foster care, and still another portion of these children are being adopted by parents they had never previously met. And the final data on this table are showing us that approximately 10% of the children in care in 2020 were on track to age out of foster care, which means becoming an adult without permanent connection to a family. So this table shows us the reasons why children were removed from their biological family to be put into state custody in the 2019 fiscal year. And these proportions are all very similar over the most recent years. Nearly 2/3 of the children removed from home are removed due to instances of severe neglect. These categories are not mutually exclusive though. So there could be overlap between the percentages, or a child could be removed for a number of these reasons at the same time. So in other words, children who were removed due to parent substance use, drugs, or alcohol could be counted in the category of neglect, and often are. But you can see that neglect and parents' use of drugs are the reasons a large number of children in 2019 were removed and placed into foster care. Other reasons include parents' inability to cope or control their child's behavior, parent incarceration, and of course, physical abuse. But physical abuse is the reason for removal in only 13% of the removals in 2019. So this graph of the US states shows the percentage of children removed due to parental alcohol or drug use. So I'm kind of zooming in on that a little bit. The national average is nearly 40% of children placed in foster care are removed from home due to substance use. But 10 out of 50 states, so this kind of maroon color, shows this percentage to be above 50%, and then over half. So if you count all of them that are in the blue shades and the maroon shade, so that's about 28 out of the 50 states show that this percentage is over 40%. So at least 4 out of 10 children placed into foster care in 2019 in over half of the states of the United States were removed due to parents' substance use. This table shows us the age breakdown of children who entered foster care in 2019. Again, these percentages are very similar in the most recent years. The largest proportion of children entering foster care are under the age of 1. So it's our babies. Nearly 20% are placed into foster care as babies. The percentage decreases from there until about age 15 and 16, when it slightly raises again to 5%. So it is about 41,147 children out of the total of 251,359 who entered foster care for the first time in 2019. They were under the age of 1. So again, just taking a moment to zoom in on the parental substance use. Take a look at this information with regards to the ages of children removed from home due to parental alcohol or drug use in 2019. So as you can see in this graph, all of the maroon color here is 60+% of the children removed due to drugs and alcohol were under the age of 1 as well. So it can be understood through these last two graphs that a large proportion of our children who are being placed into state custody are being removed due to parents' drug and alcohol use. Substance use and addiction are not easy fixes. It takes a lot of time and a lot of resources to assist adults in overcoming substance use challenges, and the road to recovery is often marked with numerous setbacks. So you can imagine how this impacts our children while they're in foster care in the US. Okay, so as far as where children reside when they are in out-of-home placement, this chart gives us the data on children in custody in 2020. So as you can see, a total of 83% of our children are residing in single-family homes, whether they're pre-adoptive homes or foster families. Of that 83%, 45% are living with caregivers who are not blood related to them. And then the remaining, it's about 12% that live in a residential or group setting, whether that's a group home, an institution, or a supervised independent living situation. Okay, so now that we have an idea of what current data for our children in foster care across the US looks like, I'd like to take a few minutes and give a quick overview of the history of foster care in the United States. I will miss things because there's a lot of different moving pieces, but to give a good overview. The very earliest forms of child welfare were based on the colonial practices of indenture and apprenticeship from the Elizabethan Poor Law from England. These systems were set up not so much as a compassionate care for children who were in need, but more as a labor system. So parens patria is a phrase that means parent of the nation. And this was the expectation of the sovereign nation to assume the obligation of providing for children who didn't have capable caregivers. And initially this was done by providing care for children as they provided labor. As the US continued to urbanize and expand, the need for out-of-home care for children increased significantly. So initially, these increasing numbers of children who were cared for in group care institutions called orphanages. By 1880, there were over 600 orphanages in the US. During this time, things began to shift in the understanding of the role of the nation and society in caring for needy children. In the mid-19th century, the practices of an indenturing and apprenticeship began to give way to wage labor, making able-bodied adults the preferred paid worker. Additionally, as anti-slavery sentiments grew across the nation, the idea of utilizing children for labor on farms and in factories began to appear too close to enslavement. So ultimately, eliminating the view of needy children as cheap labor and increasing the awareness of the fact that children are in need of more than just food, shelter, and a job. Another really important aspect of caring for children in the United States in the 19th century was the passage of the Civilization Fund Act of 1819. This established Native American boarding schools across the US. These boarding schools were institutional settings where Indigenous children were removed from their tribes and families and placed in the schools to be taught the colonial European societal expectations and behaviors. Attendance to these boarding schools was mandatory, whether or not tribes gave consent for their children to be taken and placed in the schools. The assimilation efforts went so far as cutting children's hair, putting them in different clothing, teaching them European trades and religion, and not allowing any practice of the Indigenous culture or religions. A man named Richard Henry Scott implemented a placing out system where Indigenous children were placed in American communities for a certain amount of time with the intention of having them experience more of this colonial culture and trade, but ultimately functioned in a similar way as the systems of child labor that we mentioned earlier. So this was a very tragic time in US history in the care of children, and something that the US government continues to wrestle with, the catastrophic impacts on tribes and Indigenous people, especially since the boarding school area really just ended around 1978, which is really not that long ago. One of these efforts is the Indian Child Welfare Act that places restrictions on placing Indigenous children as they come into child welfare outside of the Native American culture. So specifically, this act requires that every effort is made for Native American children who are removed from their home due to abuse or neglect to be placed within their own tribe first. But if that's not possible, then within any Native American tribe. So only after every effort for one of those two placement possibilities to occur are exhausted, may a judge then make the decree that a Native American child may be placed outside of a tribal home. So much of the initial systems of care for children, the orphanages, the boarding schools, were organized and run by ministries and community organizations before they were seen ultimately as the responsibility of state governments. So Charles Loring Brace, he was a theology student. He was often seen as the father of the foster home system. Brace was overwhelmed with the number of children living on the streets and without parental care in New York City, and responded by organizing the Children's Aid Society. This society developed a system of placing out, so similar language, placing out children in individual homes across North America by loading trains with children and sending them out to be chosen by various adults to join their homes. This system has become well known in American history as orphan trains. In fact, it's where a lot of the language around adoption comes from. I don't know if you've heard the phrase put up for adoption, but that is really originated from this phenomenon of the orphan trains, when children coming off the trains were put up on platforms for adults to view and bid on. And in some instances, children were put up on stages in theaters and asked to perform for adults in the effort to encourage them to choose different children based on their various talents. So this is obviously a very different system and perspective than how we view child worth, dignity, and placement today. Yet at this time, there was a very strong belief that children were better off in non-kin families putting out than in institutions and orphanages in the major cities of the growing US. So as the orphan trains continued to ship children across the continent into various homes, concerns began to rise as not all of these children were being taken into homes with adults who wished to take them as their own children and raise them with care and compassion. In fact, several stories began to emerge where children were still viewed as cheap labor for farms and small business work. Therefore, the idea of professional foster care began to take hold, believing if caregivers could be compensated for their efforts and care for their children, the awareness of their well-being would be sharpened and maybe more in focus. Additionally, the creation of the US Children's Bureau and the Child Welfare League of America, they're both still in operation today at the federal level, created systems of oversight, guidance, and support for the development in a more professional foster care system. This time period in the concern and care for children is really marked significantly by growing awareness and concern for the best interests of children and families, with many child advocates voicing concerns about their well-being and the emotional development of children. This awareness, plus the understanding of what professional foster care could be, grew significantly as the United States joined the world wars, leaving many more children without parental care worldwide. So being professional foster parents actually became an important wartime job for many adults, as the Children's Bureau and the Child Welfare League of America increased recruitment efforts for more foster carers across the nation. War really had multiple impacts on the understanding of children in different ways, including the development of Bowlby's attachment theory. It's important to understand that Bowlby's theory of attachment developed from his own experiences as a child who was sent away from London as the war violence increased, leaving a deep wound and loss in his own childhood due to being removed from his home and family. The development of the understanding of attachment and the importance of the relationship between a primary caregiver and a developing child led many to question, what does it take in the care of children in need to not inflict further harm for their development and overall well-being? Really, during this time, and perhaps still some today, children in foster care were increasingly seen as damaged goods that needed some help. So after the World Wars, the US government responded to the many needs of its citizens by passing legislation to provide assistance to families struggling with poverty. The Aid to Dependent Children Act and the New Deal both were social insurance programs that provided benefits to families who previously struggled to provide care for their children. In the same vein, foster care slowly began to be more geared towards treatment and rehabilitation of families to keep families in their biological homes instead of shipping them across the continent to new homes. Child advocates and organizations struggled to find the balance of how to ensure professional foster parenting situation that most benefited children in a home-like family setting, but there was a definite push towards that type of foster care and farther away from orphanages and the institutional settings. Perhaps the most significant legislation passed in 1974 is the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act that established state responsibility for child protection. Excuse me. This act put the responsibility for the definition, investigation, and the assurance of child safety squarely in the hands of each individual state, as well as states' responsibility to recruit, train, and oversee all the foster parents or any group homes, any child in foster care, where they were residing. Numerous iterations and amendments to this legislation have evolved since its passage in 1974, including very specific state laws that I was mentioning earlier, how each state has their own policies and practices of how they enact their child welfare system. One of these related efforts of federal legislation after CAPTA is the Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997. This act created a requirement for states to find permanency for children in a limited amount of time, so that's time limited, whether that meant reunification with their biological family members or exiting the foster care system through adoption or guardianship. Much of the focus at this time was still on promoting adoption by incentivizing states who were able to increase their adoption rates. Efforts here were really focused on limiting the amount of time a child languished in the foster care system, with the perspective that not having a permanent relationship with a caregiver or family is significantly detrimental to their overall development and well-being. And then most recently, the Family First Prevention Services Act was just passed in 2018. It removed the time-limited language from family reunification services, reflecting a shift in understanding that it is in the best interest of children to remain in their biological family. Additionally, this act expanded services to biological families in reunification for up to 15 months following the time the child returns home. Family First also set even more significant limits to group homes and residential settings for children in foster care, citing research within the last, within the last couple decades that has occurred, showing better experience and outcomes for children in single family home settings and in institutions. One of these specific limitations included revising the definition of foster family home to only 6 or less children. So foster family home cannot have any more than 6 children placed in that home at one time. You can see through these various acts that I've just gone over and legislation that the understanding of the best interest of the child continues to shift throughout the years, making it necessary for legislation to shift and adjust with the new perspectives of child and family advocating. We've gone from seeing children as cheap labor for a growing industrial nation to little humans who require the most compassionate and loving care. Several previous decisions regarding children in situations of poverty or neglect in their biological homes or being raised in cultural practices that were not deemed as healthy or good for children We're focused on removing children from their biological ties and saving them by putting them in non-kin families. But these views have shifted significantly, recognizing that the relationship to biological family, specifically birth mom, is a critical relationship in the emotional and social development of a child. Perhaps one of the most obvious and complete shift in the view of the best interests of the child in the US is the understanding of what is the best setting to place a child in while they're in custody of the state. So it is clear in the focus of the most current legislation of that family first, as well as the current data of where children are living while in foster care, and really since the end of the 1900s and beginning of the 2000s, that US foster care is provided most of the time in the context of a single family home with very few institutional settings. The institutional settings that are still utilized in the US are often focused on two very specific objectives. The first is providing immediate and time-limited shelter until a family setting comes available, or a residential group care that is focused on providing higher levels of treatment and care for children who are struggling in a home setting. So these institutional settings are often maintained by shift care that is provided by adults who are unrelated to each other and unrelated to the children in their care. So we can see that several of the experiences and decisions made in the history of child welfare in the US have made significant impact on the decisions of what is the best placement for children in child welfare. Perhaps maybe the impact of Bowlby's understanding of attachment, the recognition of how orphanages and boarding schools were organized and run in the 19th century here, and their negative impacts on children who were raised in those settings, as well as the impact of so many of our children being removed from home under the age of 1 due to parental substance use and addiction. It makes sense that our country has turned towards single-family homes as the best option. Additionally, it is understood that these current institutional settings, focusing primarily on providing temporary shelter or higher levels of treatment and intervention for children with significant emotional and behavioral challenges, it makes sense that the continued research on well-being and outcomes for children in these settings are not as positive as for children who are residing in single-family homes. So overall, of course, the United States story of caring for children is still being written, and I'm sure will continue to be impacted by our history that we've just covered, as well as continually evolving societal views and opinions of what exactly is the best interest of the child. Thank you so much. That is all I have for today.
Wonderful, Professor Goodwin. Thank you so much for this informative and enriching presentation. Thank you. We'll go now to the Israel context. We have some questions in the chat. I can see them. We'll address all the questions after the second lecture. So I want to formally introduce you with Professor Anat Zeira. I believe that some of the Israeli here are already well familiar with you, but I want to introduce you formally. So Professor Zeira is a professor at the School of Social Work and Social Welfare at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She is also served as the head of research and evaluation at the Haruv Institute from 2011 and until recently, 2021. She is a founding member of the Italian-based International Association of Outcome-Based Evaluation and Research on Family and Children's Services. And she is a national and international expert in all related to services to children at risk and children in care. So I'm handing it over to you.
Thank you so much, Hanita, and thank you, Bonni, for this very, very interesting talk. I really learned a lot today. I will try to share my screen with you. And I will talk today about children at risk in Israel. I will also start with a general context because services to children at risk are very much embedded in the history of the state of Israel. So I will start with a brief note on the state of Israel in general, and then go deeper into children and children at risk. For those of you who are not familiar with our country, it's a country of two nations, Jewish and Arabs. It is mostly defined as a country of Jewish immigrants that gained its independence in 1948. Until 1948, the country was under a British mandate that ruled both the Jews and the Arabs. It was after the First World War that the whole Middle East was divided between England and France, and we were under a British rule. So many of our services and legislation is after the British tradition. In 1948, we gained our independence. This was followed by a war and a division of the country. And without getting into all the geopolitical issues, they have impact on our life till, on a daily basis. So I mentioned that Israel is a country of immigrants. It's the homeland of the Jewish people. I will just briefly go over these waves of immigration because they have some importance in understanding how our out-of-home services system was established and still operating in many respects. So until the late 19th century, what was called Palestine, or now is called Israel, had a small Jewish community that was always here since Bible time, and the majority of the people that lived in this territory were Arabs. Until 1948, until the establishment of, or the independence of the State of Israel, there were four major waves of immigration. The first wave is called a religious immigration. It was mostly in the late 19th century. It started in 1988 or 1982. It was mostly people from Yemen and also from Eastern Europe who came to pursue their religious belief. The second largest wave was until the First World War, and it was mostly pioneers from Russia. They were influenced by the Russian Revolution, and they were coming here to pursue a rural life, agricultural development, and building settlements and so forth. The third large wave was between 1924 and 1929. It is called the bourgeoisie immigration. It was mostly from Poland, of business people who came with money and therefore started many businesses, industries, and so forth. And the fourth wave was before the Second World War broke, from 1933 to 1939. It was of the professionals, mostly doctors, educators, academics of different sorts, etc., mostly from Germany. We will come back to them later. After the establishment of the State of Israel, there were major, if we can identify three major waves of immigration. One was shortly after the Second World War, mostly refugees of the war and people from Yemen and Iraq. In the mid-1950s through the 1960s, people from North Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and so forth. And in the early 1990s, it was we had a huge wave of immigration from the former Soviet Union. It was after the fall of the Soviet Union, and also from Ethiopia. Our population today totals 9,500,006, comparing to less than 1 million in 1948. So we grow in a very rapid growth. We have many children in Israel. Some people say too many. Our population of children until the age of 18, this is the last more or less the available data, is about 1/3 of the population, okay, almost 3 million children. The majority are Jewish, 72%, 1/4 is of Arabs, and the rest is what we call others, that are mostly non-Jewish immigrants typically from a former Soviet Union origin. As you can see on this chart, the rate of growth per cohort since 1970 to 2017 is 2.2. That means that the cohorts are over than doubled themselves through the years. And this has impact also on many other services to children that are needed. So this all information is about the general population. Israel is still perceiving itself as a welfare state, not as much as it used to be, unlike the United States. So we're taking pride, or we used to take greater pride in our social services. Social services are those that are provided by the government to the people that are living in the country, to the citizens. So it's housing. Unfortunately, public housing was not taken care of in the past 20 to 50 years. There was not even, I think, a single apartment in public housing that was added during this period. Our unemployment rate is around 5%. It may be different due to COVID. Now it's very different, but this is usually the typical unemployment rate, not very high. There are support. The government provides support in placement to workplace through specific agencies, and there are limited grants to the unemployed. We have also social services in education, health, and welfare that I will quickly go through now. There is a mandatory education law from pre-K, ages 3-4 to the end of high school. This is the division. We usually go to primary school from 6 to 11 and to middle school from 12 to 15, and then to high school. Supposedly free basic education, not always the case, but every child in Israel at these ages is entitled to free education in the place that they live, in the locality that they live in. Our health service, public services are very, can say that they are very good compared to other countries, and especially to the United States. We all enjoy national health insurance through the National Insurance Institute. We pay a certain portion of our salaries through health tax for this, and in return we get a basket of medical services, which includes unlimited access to outpatient clinics, hospitalization, medications, and medical equipment. It's a very generous service compared to other services, and it is especially important for children who get all the vaccinations, dental treatments, developmental delay treatments, and mental health services through these systems. In terms of health, there are about 13% of the children in Israel that have disabilities. Not all of them is a severe disability. Some of them are mild, and there is a whole range of services to people with disabilities through the health system. It is overseen by the Ministry of Health. In terms of the welfare services, there are two functions of this system, of the welfare system. One is to provide social security through the National Insurance Institute, and this involves universal allowances, such as children's allowance. Every woman that has children from birth to 18 receives a modest monthly allowance for the child. It is higher as if you have more children to a certain limit. And there is also a universal allowance for the elderly and some others. It is also providing social security by income-based or means-tested allowances, such an income support to people whose income is insufficient to enable them to provide basic needs for themselves or their families. And this is also provided by this National Insurance Institute and has no discretion. Okay, it's like income-based. You can apply, and if you meet the requirements, you would get it into your bank account. The other function of the welfare system in Israel is to provide personal social services, okay, to people in needs for different reasons. These services are provided through a network of local departments of social work services. These local departments of social services are by law housed in every local authority. Okay, this is the requirement by law. And it provides psychosocial treatment. It protects vulnerable populations such as children at risk or elderly or people with disabilities. And it also supports people with getting their benefits from other systems. So if, for example, the social workers in your local authority thought that you should receive some allowance from the National Insurance Institute, they might help you, or they should help you pursue this allowance by mediating or helping you fill out forms or providing you with information that will allow you the use of these or recipient of this allowance. So this is, up to now, this was general about all Israeli population without any specific insight about children. Children in need in Israel are mostly in need because they live in poverty. We have, as I mentioned earlier, we have many children, and many of them, too many of them, are living in poverty. The poverty line in Israel is defined as half the median of disposable income per standard person, which is today 2,811 shekels, about $850 per month. That's not a lot of money. It's actually very little. So if you are just a little bit over this line, you're not considered being poor anymore, but still you're living in poverty. We have high rates of families living under the poverty line, almost double the rate in OECD countries. We have 1 of every 5 families living under the poverty line. That doesn't mean that we don't have many more poor families that are just over the poverty line. And the rates of children that are living under the poverty line is even more alarming. You can see in the graph that there are 2 lines. The darker line, the upper one, is the percentage of children living under the poverty line before transfer payments. So these are before, for example, all the allowances that I mentioned earlier. And the lighter blue line is the rates of children living under the poverty line after transfer payments. And you can see that almost 1 in every 4 children is living under the poverty line. This is a huge number of children. We also know that poverty is strongly associated with other problems. And therefore there is an estimate, I don't know how people got into this number, but these are the numbers that are mentioned in different places, that about 350,000 children up to the age of 18 are considered at risk for either maltreatment, physical abuse, emotional abuse, or sexual abuse and neglect. Children to parents in deep distress, for example, due to domestic violence or chronic illness or poverty. Some of these children are dropout adolescents that are not in school or not at work, youth with addictions, or youth that are involved with the criminal system. All of these children are under the responsibility and receiving services from the welfare system through the Ministry of Welfare. And I think now it is called the something security, social security or something like that. In Israel, we tend to have too many elections. And after each elections, there is a shuffle between the ministries. And specifically this Ministry of Welfare is getting a different name after, almost with each new minister. So it's very difficult to follow. And I always like to refer to it as the Ministry of Welfare. So children at risk for maltreatment are identified mostly through the mandatory reporting that is Article 368D of 1989, which is part of the penal law of 1977. It was introduced after a severe case of a child that died because her uncle abused her severely, and nobody, some people, her family knew, some people around knew, and nobody bothered to tell anyone about that. She was 3 or 4 years old, and that was a very shocking and alarming case. And this mandatory reporting was established right after that. So every citizen 18 years old and up that suspect that a child was harmed by a responsible adult, and this could be a teacher, a parent, a relative, somebody who's with the child and responsible, an adult 18 plus that is responsible for this child, and abusing him or treating him, harming him in any way, they need to be reported either to the police or to social services. And if you don't do this, you fail to do this, you are subject to punishment. This punishment is harsher. It's double the time, let's say, in jail for professionals who neglect to report than it is just for any citizens. I personally don't know of a single person in Israel that was ever incarcerated for neglecting reporting, but that's the law. So the reports go into the authorities, either the police or child or the welfare services, child protection services, and you can see the trends of reports or children reported from 1995, shortly after the mandatory reporting was put in place, up to 2015. And you can see that the rate per 1,000 children has increased tremendously, but the numbers are more or less around the 40,000 plus. The system of collecting this data is not very accurate. The number of children, is it the number of children? Is it the number of reports? We have a huge problem with data in Israel, specifically data on children at risk. And I really envy the data that Bonni could share earlier, because our national authorities are not doing enough to collect data, and specifically data on children at risk that will enable us to learn systematically from real life how to plan interventions, for example, or enabling us the proper evaluation of interventions that are being implemented. In terms of the reports, the data here is until 2015 because it comes from different sources, okay? And each source has a different way of counting and reporting, and some of them report calendar years, some of them report fiscal years. It's quite a mess, but if we look, if we take a certain year and we look at gender, for example, so we see that boys account for more reports than girls do. The age range shows that the highest category of age is the primary school years from 6 to 13, which account for a little bit over 40% of the cases, and more and a little bit lower for older children. It doesn't mean that this is really all the maltreatment that we have, but this is how the reports are shown in this specific Israel National Council for the Child report for 2016. I think similar to other countries, the highest rate is for reporting due to neglect, followed by physical abuse. Children could be reported for more than one reason. So sometimes the numbers don't add to 100. In terms of the relationship between the victim and offender, still referring to 2015, you can see that most of the reports are about abuse by a responsible person within the family. So it's either a father, an older brother, an uncle. I use male language because typically the offenders would be male, but it doesn't mean that there aren't any women or mothers that are also abusing their children. So coming into the services for children at risk, our services range from, on a continuum, from preventing further risk to the child to protecting children. So we have a range of community-based services and also a range of out-of-home placements. The community-based services are provided, as I mentioned earlier, by the local departments of social services. For example, some of them are parent-child treatment centers where families would go once or twice a week and do some psychoeducational interventions of improving parenting or learning how to play together, how to have better household rules and so forth. Maybe you know Safe Care, if you are with the American audience, may be familiar with Safe Care that was developed in Atlanta and was also tested in Oklahoma. So there are many such interventions that are provided through the local departments of social services. We have daycare centers to which children would go from early morning hours to late afternoon and receive most of the care needs. And also parents would receive some kind of intervention. So we call them multifunctional daycare centers. We have advocacy centers, and we have somewhat similar to what you have in Tulsa in Oklahoma, and they are which are one-stop service for all kinds of advisories or how would I say? My English today, I don't know what I had. I think I had something, and I find myself stuck with words that I cannot find. So I apologize for that. On the other continuum, we have the out-of-home care, which is largely divided to three types of services. One is of emergency centers or emergency foster families, which is for children who needs to be removed immediately. They are at imminent risk, and there is no time to consider, where is the best place to place them. And they are hosted there for a limited length of time until a decision is made where to place them on a more permanent basis. Hanita mentioned in her introduction that our residential care system is very large, about 72 to 75% of the placements are to residential care. These are either group homes or small and large facilities. And we have about 1/4 of the children that are placed with family foster care. That are placed to family foster care, sometimes in the family, kinship foster care. I'd like to say something about permanency and adoption, because this is something that is very different in Israel than it is in the United States. As Bonni mentioned earlier, I would like to say ideology or the values that direct the policy of out-of-home placement in the United States is towards permanency. this permanency is achieved either through adoption or reunification with the birth family. In Israel, we have very few adoptions annually. We have roughly about 100 adoptions. I'm not counting international adoptions of people or of people who are adopting from children from other countries, but I'm talking about children that were born in Israel. The department in the Ministry of Welfare that is responsible for adoption is working towards a more open adoption possibilities in which the ties with the birth family would not be completely cut. But still, adoption is not a very popular, I would say, option for children. In fact, Israeli families who are looking to adopt a child usually would adopt a baby, a newborn, and there are children, not many of them, but there are a number of children that are waiting to be adopted at the ages, of 4, 5, 6, and higher that nobody wants, which is very, very sad. So permanency is not a major goal for Israeli out-of-home care services. There are many efforts invested in keeping in touch with the birth family, even if a child is removed at a certain age and would stay there until the age of 18. It is also, I don't know, maybe historically or other reasons, adoption services are not very popular. So how children are being placed in a welfare placement? Every effort, first of all, is made to keep the child at home with the birth family through the preventive services, okay? So if it's not possible because there was a mandatory reporting or other information that came into the knowledge of the authorities, there is an investigation opened by a child protection officer. This is also a very a great difference between Israel and the United States. In the United States, as far as I know, at least in some of the states, a child protection officer is not necessarily a social worker. It could be anyone with a degree, or sometimes not even with a college degree, that got a training, very short training sometimes, that would nominate him as a child protection officer, which is only responsible to remove children from home. They do not provide any further interventions. In Israel, the child protection officers are specialist social workers, typically with a lot of experience, that are nominated by the Minister of Welfare to act according to the law, to specific law. And one of their roles is to remove children from home. So after an investigation is being opened up by a child protection officer, they need to determine if there is a need, if the child is in need to be removed from home. And there are certain criteria in the law. Sometimes they would go to the court to issue a court order. And sometimes they would just use their authority to remove a child without a court order up to 7 days. We don't have any actuary risk assessments. The assessment if there is a need or how much risk a child is having is mostly based on the discretion, professional discretion of the social worker. And this is a huge difference. It has, of course, pros and cons, like everything else, but it's a difference that should be noted. So if it's an emergency placement, I mentioned earlier the emergency centers, or if it's babies or very young children, and sometimes they would go to emergency foster families. After that, there is a planning and decision committee that would discuss the situation of the child, and it is a multidisciplinary committee that weighs all the options and make a decision about the best placement for the child. I will start with family foster care. I said about 23% of all out-of-home placements are to a foster family or kinship. There are huge efforts made to put children with relatives, grandmother, aunt, big brothers, and so forth, but it's not always possible. I don't have the exact data about the proportion between these two types of foster. Children of the younger ages, up until they are 6 years old, are mostly referred to foster families. There is a goodwill to avoid placing them in residential facilities. So mostly family foster care is for them. We have a relatively new law. It's called the Children Foster Care Law from 2016, which anchors the rights of children in foster care and the duty of the state to ensure their good and rights according to the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. It has a lot of details about the rights and the duties of the foster family. For example, up until the introduction of this law, if a child needed, for example, some kind of invasive treatment or even dental treatment or any other type of medical treatment, they needed to get the permission of the birth families for that. And this was sometimes being ridiculous. So this law really straightened up the rights and the duties of the foster family as well as the payment they receive. In terms of residential facilities, again, we need to place them a little bit in historical context because this explains why we have this kind of huge residential system. Before 1948, the ethos of the Zionist movement ruled. The idea that children should be living in rural life, doing, working in the fields in the morning, alongside getting their education, or the shared living of the kibbutz. Those of you who are familiar with this type of living, were really those that dictating how children should grow up in Israel. And many youth villages or residential facilities were established for people that, for the normative city people that wanted their children to grow up in such environment. In fact, these were the elite forms of education in many respects. Also, the refugees of the Second World War that brought to Israel many children without their families, orphans, helped develop this form of residential care. After 1948, the ethos of the Zionist movement shifted from shared living to an agricultural life to being a melting pot. That means that you take all the Israeli children coming from very different places around the world. You saw the immigration waves. You put them together in a facility, and here comes the typical Israeli out of there, sharing the same education, the same values, and so forth. This also was done to provide opportunities to the social periphery. Immigrants from the North African countries that came in the 1950s and 1960s were considered less developed or less familiar with the values of the government and of the central education system. And it was an opportunity to give them the desired education. This is somewhat similar. I don't want to say similar, but it reminds what Bonni mentioned earlier about the indigenous and the Native Americans in the late 19th century in the United States, transforming them into Israelis. Until 1948, there was no clear policy about out-of-home placement of children, and children were sent wherever there was an availability. During the 1960s, the differentiation between the welfare and the educational needs of the children was developed, and therefore we have different types of care settings.
Anat, I'm just taking advantage of the time that you're drinking. We have for your lecture 5 more minutes, and then we'll go to discussion.
5 more minutes it will be. So we have educational settings, rehabilitation, therapeutic, post-hospitalization, and correctional service. The educational residential care emphasizes education. It serves as a vehicle for social inclusion, mostly of new immigrants, and it is supervised by the Ministry of Education. It is guided by a social pedagogue notion. The welfare residential care is divided to different types of facilities that are different than one another according to the severity of the harm to the child. This table here shows some of the differences between these two systems. The educational system is much larger than the welfare system. It's almost doubled in the size of the number of children that it has. You can see the different trends of utilization through the years. While the numbers in the educational system is getting a little bit higher, the number of children in the welfare system is decreasing. Certainly in terms of percentage of the population, as you saw, that is keeping going up. Both systems has higher rates of male residents, and the age categories differ because in the educational system, the children would go only from the end of primary school, and the majority would be coming into the youth village or the educational system residential care at high school, while the welfare system, as I said, the younger children would go to foster families, and the older children would go to the residential group homes or other residential settings with a bigger group of children or adolescents, 13 to 18. The average length of stay is not determined. We do not know, we do not have data on how long children stay in out-of-home care, but we know that children are admitted at different ages, and therefore the length of stay, I would say, in educational system would typically be the entire school years, high school years, and therefore would be 4, maybe a little bit over 4 years, while children in the welfare system typically would not go home if they were removed. So the length of stay of children in the welfare system is higher than it is in the educational system. So I will stop here. I listed, I don't know if this is going to be available, but there are some references here if you want to deepen your knowledge with the Israeli system. And I would like to thank you for listening. You have my email. If you want to email me, I'm happy to share more information.